Hello. Much of what Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, or the broader globalist regime pushes on the country is deeply resented and even resisted. At the same time, the Labour Party and the broader regime know that if they only ever take, the people will eventually fight back. How then will the Labour Party push policies that they know will be unpopular, yet simultaneously keep people bought into the deceptive frame of electoral politics? Watch this video to find out. Many of the rules and laws by which the world works have a number of parallels in various different fields. This is undoubtedly true of negotiation strategy and politics. One tactic of negotiation that is commonly understood is what I call the Haggler's Gambit, more commonly known by the less romantic term price anchoring. In this case, someone wishing to sell a product will start by giving it an unreasonably high price, then, through negotiation or discount, actually sell it at what seemed like a significantly reduced price. Due to the fact that the buyer is primed to consider the absurdly high price as the default, they value the new price in terms of how much of a discount they are getting, rather than the price in and of itself, which is usually still very high. Though some people are savvy about this tactic and adjust their brains accordingly, most do not. Even fewer still recognise this process as it applies to politics. Let's say that instead of trying to sell an expensive product, the government wants to push a policy that they know will be unpopular. They know that if they were entirely honest about their plans, they would not have public approval. What they do instead is far more cynical, but far more effective. Rather than simply pushing the policy through, they push an unreasonably extreme version of the policy through. Inevitably, this outrages the public and there is immense backlash. Yet, as was planned all along, the government can then appear to reverse course and scale back the policy. They can make a concession here or there. Now, to the general public, it looks like the extreme policy has been avoided and the moderate policy that remains is far more palatable. Much like with the Haggler, wherein the actual price paid in and of itself is still very high, the government's policy too is still extreme, though the public have been deluded into thinking that it is only moderate. The Haggler's Gambit, making an extreme cost seem moderate by first introducing it at an elevated level, is a highly effective psychological manipulation tactic. So long as the government can weather the storm of early resentment, they can push these deeply unpopular policies through whilst making people think that they aren't even that extreme. And there's another benefit too. The people feel like they have achieved something. To stick with the analogy of the Haggler, it takes two to negotiate. The seller may set the first price high, but it is the buyer who is trying to bring it down. In some cases, of course, the negotiation can be on an equal footing. However, in the case where one party is trying to be reasonable and the other is trying to be exploitative, the scales are anything but balanced. Even so, the naive buyer may think that getting the price down from £100 to £60 is a great achievement, a 40% discount. Yet, of course, the seller never actually intended to sell the product at £100 and would have agreed to sell it for £30. What's important to notice though is that the buyer felt like he did something when in reality the seller is the one with the power. This is also true of politics. To return back to our manipulative and exploitative Labour government, when the government pushes through the initial extreme policy, they know that it will be deeply unpopular and they know that they will face significant backlash. Though I'm sure that if there was no backlash they would simply go further and further, they are generally realistic about what they can achieve and account for the resentment they will receive. Then, rather than permanently holding steady on all their extreme policies, they make concessions here and there, as I described in the previous segment. What this means though is that a large number of people, those involved in resisting the policies in whatever way they do, be that writing letters to the MP, tweeting into the ether, or going on a protest, feel as though their collective actions are what force the government's hand and that they are the reason for the extreme policies being abandoned. The reality is instead, of course, that the Labour government always planned to concede a few points here and there, and they were merely letting the people feel like they had a level of power. This illusion of resistance keeps many people bought into the democratic system and trains them to keep trying to enact change through democratic means. The reality, however, is that despite their resistance, the regime still gets what it originally wants, the people still get screwed over, and the people remain wedded to the lie that change can be forced democratically against the regime's will. Rather than the people waking up to how powerless they truly are and then trying to form networks and power structures outside of the regime, they are instead trapped inside the regime framing and are fooled into thinking they actually did something, after which they can all go home very pleased with themselves, ignorant to the fact that they have still taken a massive loss. This is the illusion of resistance. This is containment. This keeps the right pathetic and subdued, made to fight for scraps that were rightfully theirs to begin with. It is a very powerful and effective strategy of which we must all be aware. As I intend to make a separate video outlining this Labour government's plans for its 5 years in power, I must spare the specific details about what I think they'll do. However, I can give you their broad strategy. Naturally, any incoming government has a list of policies they would like to enact by the end of their term. These policies will range from the deeply unpopular to the broadly popular. In the course of enacting them, however, they may employ much smoke and many mirrors. Anything from misdirecting the public through statistical lies, to intentionally predicting things will be worse than they actually expect them to be, to the sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back Haggler's Gambit in this video, can be used to win a government approval in the later stages of its term. The exact strategy of the current government depends largely on whether or not they plan to have a second term. In any case though, the government, and indeed the regime on the whole, knows that it must maintain at least some level of popular approval, lest it face the sort of destruction recently seen by the Tory party, which may never again rise to power. Also, whilst populism is largely a delusion, I do believe that elections themselves do have importance, meaning that any government seeking to stay in power should prioritise popularity closer to the election cycle. However, even if the regime plans to switch which party rules next, their strategy is, broadly speaking, much the same. For these reasons, I believe Labour's plan has been to try to enact their most unpopular policies first, and then for the rest of the time try to appear more moderate and more palatable to the British public. This would explain why Keir Starmer has been relentlessly pushing despised policy after despised policy. However, I suspect that they have gone harder than they ought to, and the backlash has been worse than they expected. And I believe recognising this, they have tried to strafe rightwards far earlier than originally planned. This would explain why Keir Starmer's new stance on immigration, which parrots a lot of what the true right have been saying for decades about immigration being an intentionally evil plan by design, has come seemingly out of nowhere. To my eyes, it appears to be a somewhat desperate attempt to claw back support by going after the single most important issue to Labour's traditional working class voter base and indeed the nation on the whole. I made a video about that issue here, and in it I say that if Labour can stay true to Starmer's promises, they may just save their government. If not, then the regime first may seek to get rid of Starmer, or failing that, prepare for the next government after Labour, which I suspect will include reform. Lastly, it should be noted that whilst I have talked chiefly about Labour in this video, I believe that all major parties are in league with the same globalist British regime. As such, the regime plan should not be thought of as being contained within this party or that party, but should instead be seen as a cross-party, cross-election plan designed to achieve the regime's goals in whatever way keeps people most engaged with electoral politics. Indeed, I believe that what we have seen in America with Donald Trump's victory, and now Vivek and Elon's latest pro-immigration sentiment with the H-1B visas, is the American regime employing on a bigger scale the same sort of Haggler's Gambit. There, the Democrats have represented the extreme, so the Republicans can represent the moderates. I suspect too that the regime in Britain is preparing its own apparent shift to the right to re-engage the many disaffected British voters with the system of electoral politics, a plan for which I believe reform will play the leading part. As reform is increasingly flooded with Tories, including many Tory wets, I am becoming more and more convinced that this is the regime plan. Anyway, that is all. To summarise, I think the Labour government has been purposely pursuing extreme policies, so as to later make a few concessions here and there, thereby both getting what the regime wants and tricking people into believing they have power when they are instead unwittingly playing the part the regime has designed for them in order to keep them bought into the lie of democracy. I suspect that we will see Labour cut back on many of its policies, possibly including scrapping the Chagos deal and reducing the farmers' inheritance tax, and that Labour will henceforth try to appear more moderate. If I can offer any advice to truly resist these tactics, I would encourage people to try to remember how things were and how they are now, and compare the policies of today to the policy landscape before the general election. Constantly remind people of what the actual norm is, and don't let them get suckered into the initial extreme policy, which later gets reduced to a marginally less extreme policy. The false concession is not victory. Do not fall for the Haggler's Gambit. Other than that, I thank you for watching, and I hope that this video has made you all that bit wiser. If you would like to support me, I have a Buy Me a Coffee page linked through the on-screen QR and in the description below, and I am also fairly close to reaching the threshold for monetization and expect to hit that milestone in the next few months. In the meantime, I hope you have a good 2025, and if you could, please like, subscribe, and God save the King.